now recorded. So I'm delighted now to introduce Ruth Farnan. Ruth will be speaking about her experience of working towards a reopening for a third time now, and exploring her challenges and learnings from last year, shaping the Ashmolean volunteering programme and practice that, and looking into the future as well. Ruth will be exploring some of the opportunities and pitfalls that have arisen over the past year and some of the ongoing ethical challenges that have been highlighted as we continue to navigate towards our recovery and reopening of museums. So I'll hand over to you, Ruth. Welcome. Thank you for coming along today. How are you?
Yeah, good, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. So I'm going to start sharing my screen now, hopefully. So let me know if you can't see my presentation in a moment. So hopefully that looks all good. Brilliant. So yeah, thank you, Will. I'm the volunteer manager at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. And so I'm going to be talking about reopening the museum for the third time. And I will be speaking about the past year and our experience of the past year, but not giving a kind of comprehensive overview because I've already spoken about that. So I'm just going to talk about specific points that are relevant to where we're up to now, basically. So that's what I'm, and then looking at some of the challenges and the opportunities that have presented themselves throughout the last year, and how all of that is going to shape the future of volunteering at the Ashmolean. So the start of the pandemic was a bit of a shock. So we were halfway through a successful Rembrandt exhibition, and that's Rembrandt looking shocked in the middle of the screen there. So we obviously had to close the museum and shut down all volunteering quite suddenly. And there were so many questions and unknowns at that point in time. And also the government guidance and the university guidance was changing all the time. So it was a really difficult period for everyone. A colleague of mine actually described it as like trying to play a game of chess when we were working towards the first reopening, but with half of the pieces missing, which I thought summed it up quite well because it was such a changeable and unknown situation. And then added into that, there was all of the anxiety and the grief and personal challenges that everyone had to face last year in one way or another. So we were lucky in that we were able to get 2 remote volunteering opportunities up and running not long into the first lockdown. And it was really due to the hard work of 2 volunteer supervisors in the Western Art Department and the Coin Room at the Ashmolean. In the months and the years, in fact, leading up to the pandemic, that meant that these opportunities were, we were able to offer them in time for the first lockdown. So remote volunteering obviously isn't for everyone, but it was still good to be able to offer some way for volunteers to continue to support the museum, because as I'm sure everyone else found, there was
the costings for the daytime.
Huge appetite for volunteers to carry on supporting the museums through this really difficult time. And remote volunteering roles do offer an accessible way of volunteering for lots of people, in fact. So it's good that we were able to get these up and running. So when the museum decided to go for an August reopening, and this is Zar, our director, opening the museum last August, obviously the safety of everyone was the #1 priority. And it was decided that none of the previous on-site volunteering roles would be possible at that time. We did instead create a new role of welcome volunteer, and we opened this up to, so we surveyed the existing team to get a sense of the appetite for coming back to the museum, which was very high. Although lots of volunteers obviously at that time were still feeling really anxious and weren't ready to return, which was completely fine, and there was no pressure to come back before people were completely ready. But we also opened it up as widely as we could and advertised it really widely. And we had a huge number of applications, a lot of them from young people who were looking for opportunities, which were quite thin on the ground last year because lots of things still weren't opened up and still aren't open, in fact. So we had a really nice mix of existing volunteers from various different teams who were really keen to support the museum, and then brand new volunteers who'd never done any volunteering at the Ashmolean before. So the new role was a brand new role. So instead of revising existing volunteer roles, we kind of went completely back to the drawing board, and it was planned in from the start of the reopening plans, which I think was really important. It wasn't just added on as a kind of a response to people wanting to support the museum. It was actually built into the reopening plans. And there are lots of things about the new role which have been really successful. So although it was a response to all of the safety precautions and the new kind of visiting procedure that's in place at the museum, it's allowed us to kind of experiment with doing things a bit differently at the museum. So we have, the team is kind of positioned around the museum at various points in the building, which, rather than being all together on a desk, which is one of the roles we had previously at an information desk. And this is obviously an old or an early kind of mock-up for what the one of the positions would look like, because these two people are clearly not socially distanced. But so spreading the positions around the museum allowed for social distancing, but also meant that the volunteers get to see more of the museum and are kind of present in more of the museum, which, when we conducted review meetings with the team about a month or two into the role starting, most of the team actually really enjoyed that opportunity to kind of be more part of the whole museum. And it also offers a better visitor experience because the volunteers are always nearby wherever visitors are in our fairly large and fairly confusing building. So the volunteers rotate around these different positions every 30 minutes. So again, they're not in any place for too long, so it hopefully keeps it really interesting. And they don't get bored of being stuck in one spot for too long. And there's also flex in the rota. So if volunteers can't come in on a particular day or don't show up for whatever reason, we can just reduce down the number of positions in the museum. So there's flex in the rota, which is really appreciated by the duty managers who kind of run the show front of house day to day and supervise the welcome volunteers. And we've got this really good mix of previous volunteers who know the museum really well and brand new volunteers who are, you know, excited and keen to get to know the museum and share that with visitors. And there's been a huge amount of support from the existing team in helping the new team get to know the museum. So as my colleague who's on the screen there shows on her t-shirt, there was a real sense that everyone was in this together and a real kind of feeling of optimism and excitement about the museum being open after such a long closure. So hopefully we'll see that again next week when we reopen the museum. So I think positioning it as a brand new role rather than revising an existing role made it really clear that we weren't just doing things as they've always been done, partly because we couldn't, because of the new system in place and all of the safety measures, but also to kind of experiment and try new things, try new ways of working. So although the safety measures forced us to change the role of the volunteers on site, it also allowed us to break the mold and try new things, some of which has been really successful and will be continuing into the future. And I think it was really important to be honest with the volunteers and transparent about the fact that because this is a brand new role, we're all feeling our way a bit, and we really encouraged feedback from the volunteers about how it was all going and visitor comments and questions and feeling. And that's really helped to shape the role and the visitor experience as well. And also I think helped to show the volunteers what an important part of the museum they are, and that they, as the people on the ground, alongside the front of house staff, have, you know, such important insights to be gained from listening to them. And we were also really clear with the front of house staff and the new volunteer team where the boundaries lay between the roles and the expectations, so that there wasn't any anxiety amongst staff about volunteers taking over their jobs, which is particularly important with the challenges that museums, lots of museums are facing at the moment. Yeah, just help to kind of build a really strong team with a lot of support from volunteers and members of staff. So volunteer engagement has definitely improved throughout the year, as I suspect it has for everyone. So it was such a new situation at the start of the year, and we hadn't trialed lots of the things that we've now gotten so used to. And so we have been doing regular online meetings and training sessions and collections highlights, lots of which has actually opened up accessibility. So for example, at our collection highlights sessions, which we now run once a month, and will hopefully continue to run into the future, we've been having consistently high numbers of volunteers and front of house staff attending those sessions, and they're delivered by our volunteer tour guides. And these are some of the topics that they've covered over the last few months. But there's this huge appetite for learning about the museum and the collections that's always been there, and in fact is, you know, one of the biggest pulls to the museum and to museums, and why people want to volunteer and work in museums. So having that space to and the time to set up and deliver and attend to these sessions has been really positive. And we're also lucky enough to be part of GLAM, which is the Gardens, Libraries and Museums of Oxford University. And there's a cross-GLAM team who work with volunteers at all of the different sites, who've also been developing lots of really good ways to keep all of the volunteers engaged throughout the year, whether or not they were actually doing any volunteering roles. And that's been hugely valued by the volunteers. So the challenges. So although the digital has obviously offered us and shown us the benefit of lots of digital engagement, there are some volunteers who can't access any online sessions. And so I think in future we need to bear that in mind. And although we're going to continue with lots of the online initiatives, we'll need to take a blended approach and build in on-site sessions when we can. Another challenge has been balancing the duty of care and for the safety of our volunteers with trying to avoid discrimination based on age and health. And so at the moment, the Oxford University guidance is that we still shouldn't be accepting volunteers on site who are extremely clinically vulnerable, which has caused some disappointment amongst the existing team wanting to return, and also new volunteers wanting to get involved with the museum. So that will continue to be a challenge that we have to navigate. And actually the vaccination programme adds another level of complexity about that. And in fact, as somebody was saying at the start, you know, there's so many personal opinions about where the line is drawn about all of these issues. So it will be a challenge that we continue to have to navigate. Promoting opportunities as well. So finding the balance between wanting to be as inclusive as possible and open the net and open up opportunities to as many people as possible, while also valuing the experience of existing volunteers has at times been a bit of a challenge, and one which we'll continue to have to navigate, but hopefully less so as we're able to offer more opportunities at the museum. And I think something which we're expecting to have to navigate as a museum is the balance between visitor anxiety and visitor frustration. So at the moment, we're in a way protected by the government, the law, which says we have to have all of these safety measures in place to protect everyone at the museum. But when that goes in June, potentially, I think it's potentially going to be a challenge to get the balance right between for those visitors that are still feeling really anxious and worried about visiting and want all of the safety measures in place, and then those that are just frustrated and fed up with all of the restrictions. And amongst the volunteers and staff as well, I'm sure there'll be differences of opinion. And like I say, one of the main challenges has been the really limited range of roles. So we've only had the 2 remote volunteering opportunities, and then the 1 on-site opportunity. And obviously having a wide range of roles available leads to more inclusion, because you've got more things to offer different people that want to volunteer in different areas and for different reasons. So that will definitely be a priority of the programme going forward. And they're just some of the roles that used to exist. So we'll be reviewing our recruitment and engagement strategy in light of some of the things that I've been speaking about. So for example, enhancing digital, definitely, but also being aware of the limitations, and really prioritising opening up pre-existing roles and creating new roles. This was already a priority of the Ashmolean before the pandemic, but then it's all been kind of put on hold for the last year. So that's going to be a real priority of ours, to create lots more opportunities for people that want to volunteer. The cross-team learning opportunities have proved really successful, and not only, as I say, kind of feed that huge appetite for learning about the museum and the collections, but also I think brings the teams together and creates a kind of cross-team cohesion, and also kind of demonstrates the huge knowledge about the museum that the volunteers have, and the huge value to the museum. The front of house staff have been really enjoying the collection highlight sessions, for example. So we'll keep inviting them along to those. And so encouraging volunteers' voices has been really key. And I think for me, actually, one of the key lessons from the last year is that flexibility has obviously been really key in kind of adapting to all of the changes as they happen. But then, so planning as best you can based on the information you have available, but then looking at what's actually happening and listening to those on the ground and kind of adjusting as you go and trying to be as agile as you can. And so we're continuing to learn and adjust, and it's still obviously a really changeable situation, although it's looking good at the moment, and we're excited to be reopening on Monday, but just continuing to learn and adjust and be flexible into the future, I think will be really important. So that's where we're up to now. Hopefully, I realise it's a different situation for everyone, but hopefully some of that is useful, at least to see what other museums are doing, or one museum is doing.
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you for sharing your insight and your experiences over the last 13 months. It's been a really testing time for a lot of volunteer managers across the sector, and it's a lot of different experiences, as you've just said. We've had a couple of questions in, so we'll quickly go through a couple of them before we head on to Rachel's presentation. Do you have a in place a minimum or maximum number of shifts you're expecting volunteers to do during a given period of time?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and we don't actually. With the new, we used to ask for a minimum for a regular slot from a lot of the front of house roles, but now with this new team, we've actually just made the rota completely open and allowed volunteers to just sign up whenever is convenient to them, and been able to be really flexible with however much time they've got to offer. So some volunteers do loads of volunteering shifts, and they'll do several in 1 week sometimes, and then others will just do the occasional one every fortnight or even once a month, and that's still really valued, which does, I guess, increase the accessibility to a certain extent.
Thank you. And with change and with volunteer program changes, there always comes a lot of concerns potentially around like how volunteers will take, for example. Have you experienced any changes like in morale engagement because of those role changes and volunteers not being able to do what they originally volunteered for?
Yes, I think in a way, because of the pandemic and because everyone's gotten used to the fact that nothing or very few things are as they were, I think in a way there's greater acceptance than there would have been about changing roles and trying out new things. But I think on the whole, there's been just a lot of understanding that we're, having to kind of adapt as we go and be flexible, and that certain areas of previous roles aren't possible. I think there is some frustration from volunteers whose roles aren't up and running yet, that are really keen to come back as soon as they can.
Definitely. So, yeah. Definitely, I can imagine the people just waiting to get back as soon as they can. And I think my final question for now is, you mentioned how this was developed in consultation with understanding the role of front of house. Was there any like key areas that you identify being within front of house, for example, and not within the volunteer side?
Yeah, so the front of house staff they've got quite a multifaceted role, really. They're there to kind of help visitors and answer questions, which is part of the welcome volunteer role, of course, but they also have a certain amount of security responsibility and evacuation responsibility, and none of that is put on the volunteers, none of that responsibility. And also, I think even kind of handling difficult visitors, if there are anything that the volunteers don't know or that they're not able to help with, the front of house staff have to have a much better, fuller understanding of the museum. So there's much more expectation on the front of house staff to be able to help.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you for sharing your presentation today, and best of luck for reopening. I hope it all goes well.
Thank you.
And I'd like to now introduce Rachel Coman. Rachel will be sharing her experiences engaging with volunteers throughout lockdown, including digital interactions, and exploring and how volunteers connected with the various reopening periods in 2020 and now as we approach reopening on the 17th of May. As a team, they learned a lot from their experience, the good things and the more difficult things, and from getting more familiar with digital engagement and approaching challenges with a positive attitude. So welcome, Rachel. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for having me. That's certainly a big act to follow from Ruth. I really enjoyed hearing about that, and there's some things that definitely will echo from our side of things on the presentation. Right, so I'll just share my screen. This is going to be quite interesting with me. I'm learning with these things. Everybody will discover this. Right, hopefully people can see that, and I just want to press that button there. Right, so I'm really pleased to be able to kind of share with you today some of our lockdown experiences with volunteer engagement. I'm volunteer coordinator at Salisbury Museum, and I started the role midway through one of the, I would call it one of the interludes where museums could potentially be open and things like that. So I started really at the beginning of July. So today I want to focus on really the opening kind of periods where we were able to be open, and also how we engage with the engagement volunteers, and they're like our gallery guides at the museum. I also want to chat about some whole team volunteer engagement, and also some thoughts on digital engagement, and also some personal reflections for me on the lockdown and how that's impacted on my career and where I kind of want that to go. So hopefully this is all working. Open interludes. I couldn't think of any other appropriate title really. When we had partial resumption of in-museum volunteering duties, there were certain teams who were earmarked as being essential to the museum's operations, and they were the engagement volunteers, that's our gallery guides, who were there really to ensure the safe opening for visitors. Also alongside that is the collections volunteers, and they were involved in high priority projects such as the Portable Antiquity Scheme, a costume gallery project, and 2 modes related projects. So we're currently looking at getting our collections online, so there's been a big pass of work with that, and also preparation for a major redevelopment project next year, which, fingers crossed, as long as we get the funding, we're going to have a lot of work around that. So there's a lot of preparations going on behind the scenes. And last but not least, our learning team resumed their activities, with some schools visiting as well as some outreach work. Despite all of this opening activity going on, there was still a significant amount of volunteering that continued throughout the pandemic, both when we were open but also when we were closed as well. So when we were closed, and when I looked today, I've got that number totally wrong. We're looking at least 200, 250 volunteer hours submitted each month in terms of our organisational targets or key performance indicators. In reality, this figure is conservative, and it's been one of my challenges in terms of logging all of the remote volunteering hours that we've been doing, particularly with some of the work that's often carried out away from the museum with some of our collections projects. So it's a work in progress, and like every volunteer management system or kind of coordinator within a museum, it's not always perfect within your heritage organisation. So moving on to engagement volunteers and reopening, it was a really interesting, very deeply emotional experience. And I don't mean that in terms of it making me want to cry. It was very much an experience that really built some very strong relationships with a bunch of people who I hadn't met before. So a lot of them, it was the first time of them meeting me, literally within my first week or so of working at Salisbury. So training was delivered in small groups to allow for COVID restrictions, and we focused on very simple things such as our one-way route and signing in out procedures. And there was also some role changes. We decided to amend within the role as opposed to setting up a new role, as we felt that this team were going to have the right skills and experiences to be able to deliver what we were looking for within our volunteer team. So it was a bit of a different approach than the Ashmolean. So it was very much a two-way process. I will emphasise that we were very clear on what we wanted to deliver. However, with a lot of the information that was coming through about what we could and couldn't do, things were changing on a day-by-day basis. And actually, we did tweak the specific experience throughout, particularly feeding in volunteers' thoughts and their feedback and their ideas as well. And I think that further cemented the relationship building within the process. We also worked on the risk assessment. I tailored one specifically for the engagement volunteers' activities, and we then further worked that for the collections teams. And volunteer feedback was a major factor to making the document as fit for purpose and as best as it absolutely could be. So moving on to kind of whole team volunteer engagement, it's not all about the activities that the volunteers undertake. It was also a really important way of building and nurturing relationships within the volunteer team. We have about 200 volunteers at Salisbury, and it's a really vibrant mixture of people from all different types of careers. It's been really interesting with them. And at the outset, I had to very much make a decision about where we're going to focus that ongoing engagement, as my role's only part-time, it's 2.5 days a week. So we looked at a weekly update email, and I kind of designed it with a mixture of museum business and also some fun activities they could get involved with, such as online events I had seen, things that might be of interest to them. And the main thing for us in terms of our own engagement with volunteers was the virtual coffee and cake sessions I've been running since September last year. So I've delivered about 25 hours of sessions, and it's been great fun. We've learnt an awful lot from that. So moving on to talk a little bit about that. Initially, sessions were fortnightly, and they were usually followed by a short presentation and time for chatter. We've covered all kinds of subjects, everything from railway history to chocolate, rural schools, Waterloo, and also the role of media and books in museums. It sounds very deep and serious, but it was a really interesting discussion that came out from that. At the second lockdown, the sessions increased to a weekly basis with some very informal chatter sessions included, and those were equally interesting, and we were learning a lot mutually from each other. From April, I set the sessions to go monthly to allow for reopening planning, and that for me, on personal learning point of view, I should have allowed more time for that. I kind of underestimated that on quite a major scale. So we are a smaller museum than some of the organisations here today, but I know there's also some smaller groups as well, and we have about 200 volunteers, as I said before, and attendance varied at the talks anywhere from between 6 people and up to about 25-30 people, with some core regular attendees. So some thoughts on digital. It's been an amazing lifeline and keeping a link with our volunteers. And for me, it's about building that link with our volunteers. And again, the collective learning on the digital side of things, it really never stops. And I've been taught an awful lot by the volunteers. We've laughed at each other, especially when things go wrong, and they have. There's some things that I'm not going to share today, but it's been illuminating. But actually, it's about having a positive approach to things, being able to laugh at yourself and being able to actually take a step back and kind of not get too caught up on some of the smaller details that are less important things. So yeah, there's been some issues, particularly around the inclusivity, and again, digital poverty has been a massive thing. It's a personal research thing for me. Who knows, in the future there might be a PhD out there for me. Email has been less of an issue with us, as we literally only have about 5 volunteers without email addresses. And quite interestingly, one of our volunteers, Mary Crane, she won't mind me saying her name in public domain, she doesn't have email, she doesn't have computer, she has a mobile phone and we do text message, but she also writes, been writing regular quizzes for our volunteer blog. She has produced our online Christmas quiz back in December, and that was really nasty in a good way. It was a very tough quiz, but her ability to still engage with things and feel part of the experience has been really important. So there's been one of those unexpected things that's come out. I found that issues with accessing Zoom session is far more of a confidence challenge rather than a lack of technology. We've had to have a bit of persistence and some real patience and understanding and empathy with volunteers, but there's been a few that have actually signed up to come into our Zoom sessions, which they wouldn't have done at the start. So there's been the fact that they know things are going on means that they've got the opportunity to be engaging with things, even if they do it after the fact, after the session. And I found this has been unusual. Volunteer feedback about the talks tends to be pretty instant, or maybe within the next 24 hours or so, but the feedback about the update emails has been much slower, and that sometimes comes months later, often from volunteers I have not met in the last 9 months, and they say, thank you so much for keeping me in touch with how things are going at the museum. They kind of feel very much less out of the loop. So it's been something I've personally learned and I was quite surprised about. So personal reflections, I think the regular communication has been instrumental in nurturing relationships with volunteers. It's made it far easier to have those sometimes difficult conversations about how a role is going to be changing, for example, with the engagement teams, and also chatting with the collections volunteers about roles that aren't ready to be resumed again. And that's made things, I think, easier. Non-digital communication was always going to be an issue, but it was right to focus on where maximum benefit can be delivered. However, having said that, I think next time I would look at building a team of volunteers who can help with that engagement in terms of the volunteers who aren't so confident with the digital, and help me as kind of like digital buddies. And being clear about the time digital engagement takes to plan and deliver. I think I undersold myself on what I was doing just because it was just a single email or social media posts, and they don't just take 5 minutes to write away and press send or kind of click publish. So that's been a big thing. And laughter is important, especially when things go wrong. And that kind of ability to step away from the computer, even if it is to go and walk downstairs and make a coffee and come back up again, has been really important when you feel there's a sense of humour failure at risk. And it's the kindness to yourself personally. I think that comes across if you get that balance right in terms of how you feel able to interact with your volunteers. And the final one I'll say, and then I'll shut up, is never neglect your CPD, your career professional development, whatever stage of your career. And that goes for whether somebody is a volunteer or a member of staff. The digital delivery in the first 9 months of my role has definitely got me thinking about where my career goes in the future. I think it's always going to involve working with volunteers, but where that goes after that, who knows? And that's about it from me. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Rachel. That's really interesting to hear about, and I think to hear stories of your volunteers and their ability to adapt to a situation is really heartwarming. It highlights how people have had to adapt and have taken on the challenge over the last 30 months, and the importance of being aware of people who potentially are less digitally savvy and perhaps needed that support, or that just like continuous engagement in different mediums. Before we head into the breakout rooms, how is your planning and stuff going for this reopening? Is it all on track? Has there been anything different compared to previous reopenings?
I think our big kind of difference is we've gone from 4 days a week, and we're going back up to our 7 days a week opening, I think, to kind of encourage more people to come out, but also spread the visitors across 7 days. I think it feels a bit more faster and a bit more frantic this time. So I think last week I was tearing my hair out a little bit. I think it gets a bit overwhelming sometimes, but I think the fact we've got more people coming back this time, people feeling a bit more confident, has been really interesting. I've personally felt a bit more unsure about stuff as people start to become more closer and friendlier to you. You're kind of thinking, actually, I still would like to socially distance. So I think I'm seeing some volunteers next week, and I think if they run up trying to hug me, I think I'm still going to run away. But I've kind of gone back a bit, and I didn't think I would do that. I found this last part of lockdown more difficult.
Yeah, I think it's been a strange this lockdown. I think everyone had different experiences, haven't they? And as we reopen, we're not going to fully understand how people have experienced the lockdowns till they fully come back to volunteering and how we behave. And I think it's going to be a challenge for all of us over the next few weeks as museums reopen to respond to the different needs of our volunteers. But in fact, yes, thank you for sharing. It's been really insightful, and it's fantastic to see 2 museums of varying sizes today talk about their experiences of reopening and planning to reopen again.